Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 150 of the podcast. In this episode, I talk with Jon Birkmire all about having volunteer directors and coaches in your ministry. So what does it look like to structure your volunteer team and kind of build a leadership team of volunteers that lead like staff in coach roles, in director roles? We talk about how he grew that at his church, actually at two different churches, what that looks like for him. We even get into the specifics of how does that structured? What are the roles? What do those people do in children's and student ministry? So if you lead in one or the other one of those, you're going to be interested in listening to this episode. And a couple things to let you know about this episode. One, you can get the show notes as always at nickblevins.com/episode 150. Also, something special and new with this episode is I'm going to start emailing when a new podcast episode is released. If you're on my email list, you'll get that automatically. And I'm going to include usually something in the email that's exclusive that's not in the show notes. And in this episode, it's going to be Jon's slides from the Orange Conference, where he taught a breakout called Building a Leadership Team for the Future. And it was about a lot of what we're going to talk about today, but certainly some different content in there as well. So if you want to get that email, go to nickblevins.com/podcast, or even in this post, and you can sign up to get those emails every Tuesday when the podcast comes out. Now, before we listen to that interview with Jon, I want to remind you that we have 3 webinars coming up with Ministry Boost in back-to-back weeks. They're Thursdays at 2 p.m. Eastern, starting this week with Leading Ministry with the 4 Disciplines of Execution Model. Great book. Business book, but you can really apply it to anything that has to do with moving the ball forward, working on strategic plans and making progress. So we talk about that this Thursday. Next week, June 20th at 2 p.m. on Thursday, we talk about innovative solutions to solving your greatest staffing problems. So if you lead staff, you're going to want to check that webinar out. And then last is Empower Volunteers to Lead Like Staff. It's a webinar on Thursday, June 27th at 2 p.m. We're talking about volunteer coaches. We're talking about directors, the same things that Jon talks about in this episode. We're going to talk about in that webinar. So you can get all of those at ministryboost.org/webinars. Let's jump in now to my conversation with Jon Birkmire about volunteer directors and coaches. Well, today I'm talking with Jon Birkmire. Welcome to the podcast, Jon.
Hey, thanks for having me on, man. I've been looking forward to this. Excited to be on the call with you.
Yeah, well, tell us a little bit about yourself and your family and your role at Anthem Church.
Yeah, sure. So my wife and I have been married for almost 4 years now, and no kids yet. So I'm a next-gen family ministry pastor without any kids, but I remind people all the time I basically have almost 250 every Sunday. So
yeah,
so that works. But so we live in Gainesville, Florida. Over by where the University of Florida is. We're actually just a few minutes away from there. So I get to be the next gen pastor here on our staff, which means that I get to lead our staff and teams birth through college. So that's what we're doing up here and just enjoying life. I've been on staff here at Anthem for 3 years now. So haven't spent a ton of time in vocational ministry, but I'm locked in for the long haul.
That's awesome. Well, tell us before we jump in, because we're going to talk about leadership development teams, using volunteers to lead in big roles and handing off all that kind of stuff. Before we do that, though, I'd love to hear what was your journey to full-time vocational ministry like? If I'm right, this isn't your first job at a church, but tell us how you got there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and the topic that we're talking about today is really near and dear to my heart because it's really a huge part of my story. I grew up in, church world, if you will. My dad was an elder and my mom was a worship leader at a very, very large, let's just call it mega church down in Orlando, Florida. And the long story short of all of that was my parents went through a pretty nasty divorce when I was going into high school, and the church that we were going to just did not handle it well, did not love us and my family through the process. And basically kind of gave us the here's the back door kind of a thing. And so I just decided through the hurt of that and just not having my hard questions about faith answered, I was trying to kind of step out of my childhood faith and move into an adult faith. And I felt like no one had good answers for my questions. And so I just really gave up on church. I was mad at God. And wanted nothing to do with church people. I felt like they didn't like me and I didn't like them. So let's just let bygones be bygones. And so I just gave up on that whole thing and went on through high school and into college and really did the whole I'm mad at God and everyone needs to know it thing, and ended up just getting into some trouble and really having a lot of unhealthy relationships with the party scene and alcohol and all that type of stuff. I was a bouncer at a bar for a long time and just really trying to figure life out and honestly figure out life and religion through my bad church experience, through the hurt that I experienced from the local church. And so I moved to Gainesville, Florida, to go to school. And this guy kept inviting me to come and check out this church. He was like, man, this church is different. You just need to come check it out. And after he'd been inviting me for quite a few months, I said, okay, all right, I'll give this thing a try. And I did. And so I walked into Anthem Church here in Gainesville, the church I now work for, and just for the very first time met Christians who allowed me to just be me and just created a community around me, allowed me to ask hard questions. They weren't scared off by the fact that I was a, steroid infused bouncer with with like a little mini mohawk thing going on and, all of that. And, I was like living with my girlfriend at the time and they were just like, hey, listen, we just want to do life with you. And over time, my life changed because of the people who I did life with here at Anthem. And then one Sunday there was a strategic service push and they said, hey, we've got all these opportunities. And I just randomly signed up for student ministry and, long story short, fell in love with ministry. My goal was always to be like an entrepreneur, business owner. My goal was to make my first $1 million by the time I was 30. And God had other plans. And so I fell in love with ministry, stopped business school, and got my first job in ministry at a phenomenal church up in the Florida Panhandle. I had basically no experience other than I had been asked to be something called a volunteer groups director in student ministry. And so basically here at Anthem, and this is what we're going to talk about today, is that we have created an organizational leadership structure that treats certain volunteer roles like staff, but they just never pay them because they can't. And so my first step into ministry was as a volunteer director for groups for student ministry. And the rest is history, and spent 2 years at that church in the Panhandle. And then God brought my wife and I back home to Gainesville, where we've now been for 3 years.
That's awesome. So you get to come back to work at the church. I didn't know that was that was your first stop. It was the same church. Because I knew you'd worked at the other church, I thought maybe there was a different journey. Nope. But that's really cool that you got to come work there. So tell us, because we're going to dive in about the volunteer leaders and staff and all that. But give us a picture of Anthem Church. What's it look like in terms of attendance, kids, students, staff, and your role in the midst of that?
Yeah, sure. So Anthem is a North Point strategic partner. We started that way 10 years ago. And so we are, as the crow flies, about 2 miles from the University of Florida, gigantic SEC, university, state school. And then just right down the road is the #1 rated community college in the nation called Santa Fe College. So, like hundreds of thousands of college students here in our city, but also extremely diverse and extremely unchurched and dechurched. And so when Anthem started 10 years ago, our focus was really the North Point Ministries focus, which was to create a church that unchurched people love to attend and invite their friends to. And so, obviously that mission directly connected to my life. It's why I'm here, So, that's a little bit about Anthem. Attendance wise, we run about, average about 700 to 800, total on a Sunday morning. We don't have any midweek services. Everything happens on Sunday for us. So our student ministry and our kids ministry happens Sunday morning. And then we have our high school students that meet on Sunday night. And we run about 150 to 180 kids on a Sunday morning, and between 60 and 80 students, between Sunday morning and Sunday night. So that's about the scope of like the attendance size for us. And then we have 6 full-time staff. We have a lead pastor, myself, the next gen pastor role. We just hired our first ever kids ministry director like a month ago, which has been absolutely amazing. So full-time kids ministry director, full-time student ministry director. We have a adult groups director and a full-time digital creative director. So a phenomenal team here, kind of lean on staff, maybe compared to some other churches and things like that. We've got a few part-timers, but really the meat and potatoes of what gets done and what makes Anthem great, in my opinion, is our volunteer directors and coaches. And so my job is to lead the staff and lead the volunteer directors who lead our teams here at Anthem. So my focus is really on, pastoring those leaders, connecting with families, leading the vision, evaluation, and strategic alignment of family ministries.
So what's interesting about that staff when I hear that is it is lean, with that many full-time. And I don't know how many part-time folks you got, roughly.
We have 4. And part-time, is for us is, not like, we're not talking 30 hours a week part-time, it's like
12, 15, 10
to 20. It's like, oh, you're 13 hours a week, right? So we just make that work. But as far as family ministry goes, my direct area of influence, we don't have any part-time staff. It's just myself, our student director, and our kids director. So the 3 of us.
How long have you had the student director? So the kids was recently hired. So probably when you were around 700, 800. And when was the student director hired?
JC, my student ministry director, we hired him about 3 months before I came on staff. So he's been with us for about 3 years.
Okay. So you both have been there kind of together.
Yeah, pretty much.
Years.
Yep.
What's interesting about that staff structure you just shared, and it's not surprising because I feel like North Point and North Point churches prioritize family ministry more than pretty much almost any church I ever see. And in terms of budget, resources, staff, like all that stuff. But you have 3 full-time staff in your area, and then the rest of the church has 3 or 4 something together.
Yeah,
3,
which is
great. Yeah, because I don't see that. You'll see a lot of churches, 700, 800. Well, they might have a full-time kids, full-time students, but then they have another next-gen role or anything like that. A lot of times you see it a lot more and more now, but you also see it where the churches don't prioritize that. And so actually it's pretty lacking. So tell us about kind of the structure with volunteers. How does that work? And I'll be interested in what it's like now, but also like what it was like, obviously before you hired the kids director. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. When you didn't have the staff and you had to fill it with volunteers. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll just, and I'm not getting paid to do this, but I will sing our lead pastor's praises. He and another guy who there was the 2 of them that started Anthem 10 years ago. When they first started, they just knew like we're going to need to leverage volunteers. And both of them had come from, more maybe traditional church models where, historically speaking, the volunteers are really doers. They're really people who you would say, hey, thank you so much for being here today and holding this baby, or thank you for being here today and, decorating this room or putting this curriculum together. They were really doers. And we love doers, right? We love volunteers in all of our churches, your listeners, whatever their scope of influence is, we need volunteers to make Sunday happen, right? But at some point, our influence of leadership, we need to add more leaders to the team, because at some point, as your church is growing, there's only so much that you can do, and there's only so much that you can get done in a day. I talked about this recently, Nick, this idea that time is the great equalizer. I don't care what size of church you have, how awesome you are as a leader, what your budget is. We all only have 24 hours a day to get our work done and love and care for our family. And our church really wanted to start out with a healthy staff culture, a healthy volunteer culture where people were valued far more for who they are than just what they do. And so starting out, every single staff role that you could kind of think of that you would have at a church of maybe 5,000 people, we would fill those roles with volunteer leaders. They're not doers, they're leaders. They own a portion of ministry. And so that was really how Anthem started. We had an adult guest services director. And at most churches, you would pay someone to do that. If you don't have the money, then you just wouldn't have that role. And so for us, we said, well, what if we just asked people to fill that role on a, maybe 5 to 8 to 10 hours a week thing, including Sunday hours. And we said, hey, you are the owner of this ministry. You're the owner of this leadership of influence, this sphere of influence. You're going to make decisions. You're going to own this thing. We kind of joke here at Anthem. We like to say, we want to give you a sandbox and we want you to play in it. Like, here is the borders of your area of influence. Go and build something great. That's kind of how we all started. And so the same thing was true in family ministry. When you first start a church, you're not having 200 kids showing up. You might have 10. And so we just started small, but we built an org chart with the end in mind. And I think that was the key to really the success of Anthem. Was we built an org chart that we said, hey, this org chart that we're going to build for all of our ministry areas will serve us well, not only at 150 people, but at 10,000 people.
Mm-hmm. That's good. So what are some things that you did, that you had to replace yourself with?
Yeah.
Some roles that you served in, and you got some volunteers in there to lead it.
Yep. Yeah. So when I first came, let's start with Anthem, and then I can talk real quickly about the church that I was at before. At Anthem, when I first got hired here, we had a full-time student ministry director and some volunteer directors in our children's ministry area. And we had my former boss, when I was volunteering here at Anthem, he moved on and got a phenomenal job up in Atlanta. And so but anytime that a leader leaves anywhere, I'm sure you've seen this before, Nick, they kind of they're like the lead blocker for anybody else who's tired. Right.
Yeah.
So
they're
like,
true.
ooh, I'm going to follow him. And my first Sunday, I had 3 volunteer directors and coaches who came up to me and said, hey, I need a break, or I need to step down, or, whatever that was. Cause, this thing's going on in my family, or I'm tired, or, that type of a thing. And then a couple weeks later, our preschool volunteer director, who had been in that role for many years, she's absolutely incredible. She was stepping into a new season, working on her PhD. She needed to step down. And so literally in a month, I felt like the entire children's ministry volunteer directors and coaches had all quit on me. And I was like, oh my goodness, I have now become the children's ministry director in an instant, Mm-hmm. And so early on, I just went into full on evaluation mode. And I really started there. I had to say, okay, God, these are the people that you've given me to do ministry with. Who are the people that are high capacity leaders that I can ask to do more and give more ownership and influence to? Long story short, one of those people is now our full-time hire for children's ministry. Her name's Annie. She's absolutely incredible. She was working full-time in the Walgreens world. She was a regional manager, and she left that world to come and join full-time staff here at Anthem. So it was really about having to start out early and just go, hey, guys, we've got to build something new. We've got to on-ramp some new leaders. So that was really tough. I had to fill almost every role on that org chart, over the past couple of years in our children's ministry, which we'll talk more, I'm sure, a little bit later about what that org chart looks like. But so that was an interesting experience at Anthem. And then my first church experience, I was a family ministries director for a brand new campus inside of a multi-site, church, who had no volunteers. They hadn't even built the campus yet when I first came on staff. And so once again, the same idea, I said, okay, if we're going to do this at a high level, if we're going to do this well, we need to start the way Anthem started. We need to build the org chart that's not just for today, but that's for tomorrow and 5 years down the road. And so I just began recruiting, and I brought on six women, amazing women who all were in different seasons of life and had done different things as volunteer directors and coaches. And what is so cool, Nick, about that group of ladies is that all of them are now in either part-time or full-time ministry. So they went from sitting on the sideline to being a volunteer director to falling in love with ministry to choosing to work for the local church, which I just think is one of the coolest wins of that entire experience for me there up in the Panhandle.
So tell us a little bit about the org chart. I know people, it's a podcast, they can't see it or whatever. And who knows, you might, if you have things we can put in the show notes, they can picture it later. But just tell us what it's looked like, what it's evolved to now, how volunteers have filled some of these key roles, how you've moved probably out of some boxes as you replace yourself.
Yeah, most definitely. Most definitely. So for us, we really feel like having common language across the board is really important. And so every single one of our volunteer roles have similar names. And so we have the roles kind of broken down as follows. We have our volunteer coaches, our volunteer producers, and our volunteer directors. And a coach is the type of person that, when you think about your volunteer team, I'm sure that there's someone on your team right now that you would say, man, if I could just have 10 Susies, or if I could have 10 Brians, if I could just clone them, my ministry would thrive. And those are the type of people that we say, hey, you've been an amazing small group leader. We now want you to be a coach. And so that's a volunteer role for us that is really, really important, because our coaches are the leaders who invest in our other volunteers. They're the ones that invest and train. So they handle all the onboarding, all of the training. They handle care during the week. So if we've got a small group leader who is having a tough time or just, is doing great, but just needs to be checked in on, our coaches do that. And that's a phenomenal and really important role for us. Because they help make those volunteers better, which means my volunteer directors, myself, I don't even need to worry about that area of ministry. They're owning that. Our volunteer producers are just like a coach, but they're in our large group environments or in our services. So, for us, we've got small groups and then large groups. So our producers work just like a coach would in large group. They're helping make the service happen on Sunday morning, making sure all the tech people are doing their thing. And then the volunteer director role for us, is basically like any other staff role that you would have at a church. So we would call them, for us, we call our preschool ministry Wambaland. So we would say, this is our Wambaland director. And if we could pay them, we would, but we just can't right now. We're not in that place. And so they're volunteers. So we have environment or ministry director, so preschool director, elementary director, middle school, high school director roles that are all volunteers. We have large group directors who are, again, all volunteers. We have groups directors, and then we have a curriculum director. So imagine all the things that it takes to make a ministry great. We have a volunteer who owns leading and casting vision and communicating and all of the things that are important for a ministry to run well. We have volunteers that lead that. And then those directors, they lead the volunteers, they lead the coaches, they lead the producers. And again, this would probably be much more helpful for your viewers once they look at the org chart that I can provide, and you can post that somewhere. But that's really it. Like, that's the layout for us. We've got directors who lead coaches and producers, who lead volunteers, and then my staff lead those directors and those teams. Cool. I've got probably like 15 questions. Not really. I have a few. This is common. We have a very similar structure, and I get there's a lot of questions I get too. So I'm trying to get them all in order. But just to help people picture the org, how this can work in an org chart. Sure. So there's let's take elementary, for instance. There's kids in a small group. They're led by a small group leader. Is that what you call them? Yep. And we call them small group leaders. They're led by a coach. Yep. That's a volunteer, and they're probably leading a bunch of small group leaders. And then that coach is led by, is it like an elementary director, or is it the group's director? Yeah, so it really, for us, it just depends upon the size and the number of coaches, right? So like right now in our preschool ministry, our preschool ministry numerically is a little bit smaller than our elementary ministry. And so we don't have a groups director right now in our preschool ministry because we just don't really need one. There's not that many coaches. The scope of work and expectation is just not big enough to need that. Because if we did have that, it would kind of make it feel to the coaches like, I'm not really needed. You've got a groups director. Now on elementary, we do have a groups director. So it really just depends upon the number of people that are needing to be led because of the sphere of influence. And we really want volunteers to be volunteers. I don't want a 40-hour-a-week volunteer. You know, they really should be only putting in 8 to 10 hours a week.
So I think a lot of churches are really interested in this coaching thing, getting coaches in place. And a lot of the way it probably works is a staff person leads all the coaches. What does a groups director do on the elementary side that is there an elementary volunteer director or do they report right to, is it Annie?
Yep. So right now, we don't have an elementary volunteer director. That volunteer director role currently has Annie's name in it on the org chart. So that volunteer director, that volunteer groups director reports to Annie. And so the volunteer groups director just, again, takes over a huge part of what keeps a ministry healthy, especially the culture healthy, which is leading leaders. And so our groups director, she meets with all of our producers, all of our coaches throughout the week. So they have direct reports monthly. She leads the team meetings. She gets all the content together to lead those team meetings. She acts as an extra layer of care for our small group leaders. So, those roles are all about doing something. They have some type of responsibility, during the week. But it's really about influence. And handing over some ownership of that influence. So Annie so for us right now, Annie, my children's ministry director, has a preschool volunteer director, but no preschool groups director.
Okay. So it's like, I got you.
Yeah. Does that kind of make sense?
It's like the opposite.
It's the opposite.
In preschool, she's got an overall director, no groups director. In elementary, there's no overall director, but there is a groups director, which is a big help, obviously.
Absolutely. It's
just having one of those is huge.
Yes, just having one. Yeah. And so, when I coached this, one of the other things that I have the privilege of getting to do is I get to help our network partners within the North Point network. I get to lead a call group for next gen and family ministry directors all over the country at all of our different churches. And so when I talk about this idea, I kind of always encourage them to say, look at who you have and think about the best seat on the bus or the best seat on the org chart for them and put them in those roles. And so sometimes that gives them permission to say, you know what, this person, they're just better at they need to be a preschool director. We don't need a groups director right now, right? And that's true for us. We don't need a groups director because we have a preschool director right now in Wombaland. And the same thing is true in our elementary environment where because we have this amazing groups director and because of the size, we're not going to just throw somebody into the elementary director role when we've got an amazing groups director, if that kind of makes sense.
It does. And I'd love to hear about student ministry in a minute too, but I got a few more questions about how this works.
Yeah.
One thing I know when I've helped people implement a coaching structure, I had one guy where he came back with it was a great, well thought out org chart, but my impression was like, oh man, you have too many levels. You know what I mean? It was like 6 levels for a church that just didn't need it and you said that earlier where it's like, we don't want to give people a job where it's like, I have nothing to do. He had it, like he overthought it, whereas like each person was only leading like 3 people. And it's like, okay, we probably don't need that. So, but it sounds like that's true for you where you have this in place, but only if you have the numbers to warrant it, which is absolutely smart.
Yeah, absolutely. And because what'll end up happening is high capacity leaders want to feel like they're needed. And so if you just have a full org chart and you're like, oh man, I've got, 25 roles filled, but we have 50 kids on a Sunday morning, people are going to quit because their job is too easy. As crazy as that sounds, right? When it comes down to building an org chart, we need to fill roles, based on people's gifting, but just because they're gifted in that area doesn't mean we need to put them into that role just yet. You might not need them there. And so it may actually benefit your ministry better to hold off on putting that person into a role until your ministry grows to need someone like that, and that's kind of where we're at right now within children's ministry specifically is we don't need all of those roles filled. We've created the job descriptions. We know that they exist. And one day as Anthem continues to grow, we'll fill them. But right now it's just not needed.
And tell me about producers. So we do the same kind of thing. We call them still coaches, but they are producers. The difference, if you're coaching on the large group side versus the small group side, there is a big difference. And we wrestle with this tension a little bit where if you're going to lead on the large group side, you're producing the large group experience. It's a totally different skill set than just I'm leading a group of people. So do your producers, is it they wear both hats, they produce and they lead this group of people, or is it some of that handed off, or how's that work?
That's a great question. So our preschool large group is much simpler than our elementary large group. I'll just start by saying that. We use Orange curriculum at Anthem. We're super thankful for that. And so in our preschool ministry, we really only have a team leader for our large group in preschool because of how simple we've made it. We do a full production and everything, but because we run Ollie, the Ollie videos, we love Ollie, man. We love Ollie. Because of that, we don't need as many people to help make that experience happen. We really have a tech person that sits in the back of the room at our tech booth. We have 2 people on stage who are our host and worship leaders. They do it together. And then that's it. Whereas in elementary, it's a whole nother ball game where we've got worship leaders and a lighting guy and a soundboard guy and a pro presenter guy and hosts and storytellers and, the whole thing. So currently in our elementary large group, we have a large group director, and he oversees that entire experience. His job is looking at the scripts that are provided by Orange and going through. We do table readings each month, where we get some of the team together and we go through all the scripts for the month and do a table reading, and we take stuff out or we add things or we change a game or, whatever that might be. And he leads that. And then he's also the person that handles the planning center. We use PCO to schedule all of our people and create the grid. And so he handles that piece. And then he is really the vision caster for how to make large group the best that it can possibly be for the kids that are coming on Sunday. And so he owns that process as well, because, let's just be honest, just because you're a great children's ministry director doesn't necessarily mean you understand, large group or production at a high level. Or just because you're, a elementary director doesn't necessarily mean that you know everything to know about groups, right? You might just be a great leader. And so we really want to put aces in their places, and our large group director is just that. So he handles all of that. Our producers really have a Sunday morning responsibility, so that my large group director doesn't have to be in that space for all services. And so their job is to stand in the back of that tech booth and know exactly what's happening when, and to be on the comms and communicate to everybody, hey, here comes this lighting cue. Hey, the worship leader's coming out right now, that type of a thing. And then they're texting everybody. Actually, we use GroupMe, so they're on GroupMe during the week. GroupMe is a great group communication app. We use that for all of our volunteer teams. So everybody, there's like a different service time, GroupMe for everything. And then, that producer is really the person at the end of service who does our pre and post production meetings. So before every service and after every service, we're evaluating, we're figuring out how can we do this better? What was a win? What went well? What was a grow? How can we improve? And then that producer communicates to the next producer at the next service to hand off any information. Hey, we tried this game, and hey, you just need to know the pudding went everywhere. Here's how you can fix that, right? And so that's really how our producers help make large group irresistible.
So if I'm a storyteller, I got a producer who's kind of leading me, helping me that morning, get things right. Is that ultimately though who leads me all the time during the week, communicates with me? Okay, yeah. It's not the large group director guy.
He's more, Yep. And then, our large group director, he's a great evaluator. And so he does a great job of, coaching them and doing some things like that. But really their direct leader is their producer.
And then do you all, this is a little bit of a side tangent question, but do you all have your large group folks lead one service or multiple services and then rotate? No, you know what I mean? A lot of churches will do all services once every 4 weeks, or some will do the same service every week for large group. How do you do that?
Yeah, great question. So for us, we use PCO to schedule people. So we send out requests. Really, we want people to be able to attend services. We think that's really an important piece of being a part of our local church, is engaging in our adult experience on Sunday mornings. And so, we pretty much have our storytellers and worship tellers. They serve, especially our storytellers, because we're asking them to own that story and not be holding notes in their hands. They're not allowed to have notes. They need to be a full owner of that, storytelling, that communication. And so they tend to storytell either once or twice a month. And then they just let us know what service time, they would like to serve at. Most of the time they're at the same service time. Our worship leaders and our hosts, that's a little bit different. We're not we're not asking them to weekly prepare as much. Our worship leaders definitely do. And they're really more hand motion people than worship leaders. Let's just be honest, right?
Yeah.
But again, they just serve one service. They serve one, sit one. And we really find that that's important. And we also think that kids, and we know this is true for small groups, kids tend to engage better with people they know. And so for us, the more that we can keep the same faces in front of them on a consistent basis, the more trust there is, the less time we have to spend introducing people and things like that. So one of our storytellers, his name's Mr. Rob, and Mr. Rob is pretty much always at the 9:15 service, and so when they know that Mr. Rob's the storyteller, they get all excited and they're high-fiving him in the hallway and things like that. So we really try to keep it consistent. So for storytellers, that expectation is once or twice a month. Our hosts, it's more than that. And our worship leaders, at least right now, we're a little lean on worship leaders. Most of our worship leaders are serving 2 to 3 times a month.
Gotcha. And let's shift gears and talk student ministry a little bit.
Absolutely.
So I'd love to see, how does this work in student ministry world with the structure? And of course that, you've had a student director since you've been there, but tell us what it looks like there.
Yeah. So the roles are the same. We have coaches for our different small group, for all of our different small groups. It's a little bit different. Unlike in children's ministry, we have a 9:15 coach, for our service time, and an 11 a.m. coach for our service time, or coaches. Whereas in student ministry, we have our middle school and high school are separate, and we have a middle school guys coach and a middle school girls coach for our small group leaders. And right now, because of the size, we don't have any groups directors. Our student ministry director, his name is in that box. So we have the role, but that staff person is filling it, if that makes sense. And so we've got those coaches that are there. Our producers, we have producers for our large group experience. Our Sunday morning programming is very similar to anybody else's. You've got, a little bit of hang time. Then we're going to, have a hosting experience in the large group space where, the hosts come out and they do games and, discussion topics in the room and, all the good stuff. Then we're going to kick it to worship. And then we use predominantly the Orange Video Communicators, which is phenomenal. We love having that resource. And then they go to small groups. So the org chart there is almost exactly the same. We have a large group director, producers, and all of those roles are exactly the same. We have all the same, volunteers on the production team, a lighting board person, pro presenter, soundboard. We do contract our audio engineers in student ministry just because it's a much more complex, environment and things like that. So we train. We actually have a high schooler that's one of our contractors, which is amazing. She has learned how to do that. Yeah, it's really neat to be able to do that for her, and so that's how that works for us. In student ministry right now, we're a little bit lean on the org chart. But my student ministry director is working diligently to fill those roles. So we're excited because we're about to on-ramp a new large group director for our middle school experience. So, just like anybody who's listening to this call, people roll off, people roll on, and it's an ever-changing landscape on the org chart, right?
Oh, yeah. Just when you get it set, too. Somebody steps
absolutely.
off. Just when you fill one role, somebody steps off another role.
Yep, absolutely.
So tell us about, because here's what I'm imagining.
Yep.
You've got this structure, with coaches and directors. And when I talk to churches that have this, and your church has a very similar model to what you're sharing there. Mm-hmm. Although as I'm listening, I'm thinking you're leaning into some of these volunteer directors, like groups directors and large group directors, differently. And I made myself a to-do note that like we should talk about that in some way. Because in our world, coaches are carrying, think about small group coaches for elementary. Yep. They're carrying, and student ministry, they're carrying the weight of trying to help small group leaders lead small and champion that whole thing. And that's great. And that's awesome. But they really could use somebody else besides just the director over them to help them even more, especially with all the stuff Orange provides. I mean, it's like you just get somebody in there repackaging and distributing that. But here's what I'm imagining, because you're sharing this whole thing. In my experience, when churches that have this kind of structure is they just have a really good number of volunteers. Because a lot of people listening too are thinking, how in the world can I do that? I can't even get enough people to just serve in the other roles.
Absolutely.
So one, give us a picture. How many volunteers do you have in kids and students? And then we'll talk about how you recruit these folks.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as far as, the volunteer number of volunteers, I'm going to guess that at some point my student ministry or my kids ministry director are going to listen to this podcast and they're going to be yelling right now, we don't have enough. We need more.
Oh, yeah, that's everybody. Yep.
And that's absolutely everywhere. Right. And so for us, I think a couple things about our volunteer culture is that, number one, we really talk about volunteering as a next step for someone's faith journey. And we believe that especially for students and adults, but especially for students, that their faith really grows when they serve. And so, for us, we have really tried to move away from what I call the cattle call. Mm-hmm. When it comes to volunteering. I know that for a lot of churches, in fact, I formerly worked for a church that was like this, and it seemed like every week in the bulletin, there was, hey, we need this role, we need this. And what ends up happening there, Nick, in my opinion, is that just becomes noise. And what happens is people are constantly going, they always need someone, they always need, help. And people don't really understand how serving helps their faith grow, and B, that there is actually a need, but not just a big, broad need, a specific need. And so we have tried to move away from the cattle call and move towards specifically recruiting people. And so really thinking through, okay, we need 2 small group leaders, our entire staff, all 6 of us, plus our part-timers, we're constantly sharing needs with them and sharing names and trying to be open-handed. And by open-handed, I just mean that sometimes that means that guest services is a better place for someone who's serving inside of our children's ministry right now. We need to be okay, allowing them to move from children's ministry over to guest services. And sometimes guest services sends them back, sends someone else over to us. So the way I like to talk about it is you need to make friends before you need friends. You need to make friends before you need friends. And for me, that just looks like on Sunday, and the way that we've built this whole thing out is that, I kind of can lean up against the wall on Sundays. I'm not running around with like a chicken with my head cut off on Sundays. And so my goal on Sundays is if I see people I don't know, my job is to go and engage with them. To build relationships for the sole purpose of building relationships. And from those relationships, 9 times out of 10, they're someone that we get to recruit at some point. So we create a hot list of names. That hot list is constantly getting names of people who could become volunteers. And we have, specific targeted conversations with them. Hey, so-and-so, we think you'd be an incredible 6th grade guys small group leader. Could we grab coffee this week and just share with you what that would look like. And so that's been a huge game changer for us. So we have tons of volunteers, but the way that we get them, I think, is maybe just a little bit different than just the ongoing, hey, if you'd like to serve, here's a place that you could serve. We only do 2 strategic service Sundays a year. We try to time those out. So that's where our entire adult experience is all about serving. And then we don't talk about serving the rest of the year. That's kind of it for us. So that's just been what's working for us right now. My children's ministry director would probably, disagree, be like, we need more people.
Sure. Yeah.
But that's kind of where we're at on that volunteer thing. And then again, just to pull, some sticky language from Orange, we really think that retaining is a whole lot better than recruiting and, onboarding. And so we really try to create a really healthy volunteer culture where people want to stay, where they feel valued, not just for what they do, but more so for who they are. And that's helped us keep those roles going. And then we just constantly are having healthy conversations and saying, hey, you've been serving for 2 years. How's that going? Is there anything that you need? Is it time for you to take a break? Like, we should be asking people how they're doing and if they need a break before they even tell us. And I think that that's an important part of just keeping teams healthy and keeping that volunteer culture healthy. I hope that answered your question well.
Yeah, and I put you on the spot with that. Do you know how many volunteers you have in kids or students, even if you were to estimate it?
Yeah, volunteer-wise, the actual number, I would say, in fact, I honestly could not even tell you off the top of my head. I would guess that in total between all of our services, we probably have 100 volunteers between student ministry and kids ministry.
Okay. Like combined. Yep. For those 250 kids, students combined, yep. If my math was right from earlier.
Right. Yep.
So you're talking about 1 volunteer for every 2.5 kids. Again, that is probably what I see. Like churches that have the structure you have. Yep. That math, 1 to 2, 1 to 3, is usually right. Where we all know too, like you get in a lot of student ministries where it's like 1 to 12. You know what I mean? And that counts the ones that lead them. Yep. There's Absolutely. 5 leaders for 80 kids or whatever, and it squeaks by because it's probably maybe a large group, more of a large group kind of thing. But that's probably the difference there.
Honestly, that's why, in my opinion, sorry to interrupt you, but that's honestly why, in my opinion, that so many guys in student ministry quit after a couple of years.
Oh, yeah.
The turnover in student ministry is so high. And I think it's because there's this unnecessary burden placed on student guys and girls that's like, you need to be all things to all people all the time. Mm-hmm. And that's such an unhealthy thing to expect of, in a lot of cases, a young leader. And so what you're talking about is that 1 to 12 thing in student ministry where, the student guy, he's like a one-man band or she's a one-man band. And so for us, we've really tried to push up against that norm in student ministry and go, nope, our student pastors are our small group leaders and we treat them that way.
And here's the other question that would come out of that, and people ask me this too when they're asking about coaches, especially saying, well, do I recruit a coach before I fill all my slots as volunteers, all the volunteer leaders, whatever you want to call that? Like, and I would say yes, but because I think part of it is when you put the structure in that you have, that's actually how you get that many volunteers. How's that worked for you?
Yeah, I would say that's also true for us. In fact, sometimes I'm even willing to pull a great coach out of a great small group leading position. Because sometimes when you create that leadership vacuum, people take notice and they follow in behind it. But you're also adding another person who now has moved their thinking from being a small group leader to being an owner of ministry. And we literally just did this, Nick, about 2 months ago. We had a phenomenal small group leader in kindergarten, which is like one of our toughest roles to fill. And I just said, man, we just need to make her a coach, which was tough. It was tough for us to make that decision. But you know what ended up happening? We made her a coach. And like a couple weeks later, she recruited her replacement. And so sometimes we just have to be willing to say, I'm going to create a little bit of a vacuum here. I understand that, but this person's going to add something to our team that's way bigger than what she was doing or what he was doing before. And then part of that onboarding process was we told her name's Melissa. She's absolutely fabulous. We said, Melissa, we need you to recruit your own replacement. She's like, duh, I got this. So high capacity people are always going to go out and they're going to chase down their own replacement so that they can take on more influence and leadership.
That's awesome. Well, we're running out of time and I have a lot more questions, but I'm going to get this one in and another one just about how people can connect. But
let's do it.
So you got this whole structure.
Yeah.
And sort of this like two questions in one, but how do you lead through this? What do the meetings look like? Like, how do you lead your staff and they lead their directors, who lead coaches? Like, how does that all work?
Yeah. So I'll make that answer really quick. The way that I see myself. So if you're a next gen person or a family ministry, person, I really feel like our role, if we are handing off the appropriate parts of ministry, in my opinion, and I'm not an expert, but we'll call me a quasi-expert. I think that we need to lead pastorally. We need to lead with vision. We need to lead with evaluation, and we need to lead strategic alignment. And my job and my workflow is broken up into those four areas. And so notice that all of those things are things that only I can do. And so everything that I do, from leading volunteers all the way up to leading staff, I'm really focusing on, am I caring for people pastorally? Am I casting a compelling vision? Am I evaluating what we're doing and who we're doing it with to make sure that it's excellent? And are all of our ministry areas, preschool, elementary, middle school, high school, and even college, are they strategically aligned? Are they all working together? Do families feel like it's one connected, ministry through the phases? And the rest of everything else, I hand off to the appropriate people. As far as leading, our volunteers and our teams, we have regular team meetings. We call them huddles on Sunday morning. They happen before service. It's about 15 minutes, before they need to be in their rooms, and that's fabulous. It's a great time to build community. It's a quick little 1 to 2 minute vision casting that our coaches lead, and then we pray for one another during that time, and then they head to their rooms. Group Me is how we communicate with all of those volunteers. And they're sharing prayer requests and they're sharing what's going on in their life, just like one big family on a group text. 2 times a year, we do team nights, which is our big get together. We do some worship together. We eat together with everybody. All of family ministry gets together for that. And then we do a big vision casting, for the next 6 months. And then something that is, I believe, vital to specifically student ministry is we do something once a month called our 30 Afters. And it's exactly what it sounds like, which is my student director basically leads a small group discussion about some of the lead small content. So once a month, they're going through a guided discussion, and he just asks questions. It's not time for him to teach or go over announcements or events or updates. This is his time to help everyone in the group talk amongst one another on how they're leading small. Are they showing up, doing time on their students' turf? How are they seeing, tricks of the trade working? And so it's a collaborative learning experience that happens once a month, and it's only 30 minutes after service. We provide food for them. And I think that's just one of the things that maybe we do that's a little bit unique, that has really helped our teams feel, connected, but also resourced to win.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. Well, I do wish we had more time, but that was really helpful. I think just breaking that down, helps people see, okay, what can I add? What's missing, in my church that we could add in there? How do I, kind of go from this org chart, this current reality to where we want to be, which is awesome. How can people connect with you if they have any questions, they want to follow on social or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not a tweeter. I'm not on Twitter. I kind of wish I was at times, but I just don't know if I have that much to say. But I am on Instagram, and you can follow me on Instagram, Jon, Jon Birkmire, Birkmire. When I spoke at Orange, I shared that with everybody. I always respond to direct messages. I've shared probably with 20 or 30 people, org charts and job descriptions and anything like that. So if you're listening to this podcast and that's something you feel like you need, or you have questions, I would love to connect with you, and answer any questions that probably this podcast has created for you. And so, that's the best way to connect with me is on Instagram.
Cool. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast, for sharing this with us. That's really helpful.
Man, thank you. I absolutely love your podcast. I love what you're doing. And I'm just thankful for the content that's on it. It has helped me immensely over the years. So to now be on the podcast is definitely, I'm like, oh man, I really hope that this content is going to be as helpful for someone as the content I've listened to in the past was helpful for me, man. So thank you so much for all that you do to help resource leaders in the local church throughout our country. It's phenomenal.
You bet. Thanks, John. I appreciate that.
Yeah, man.
Well, I remember what our ministry was like, my ministry, when I led our children's ministry, and it didn't have any of that stuff that John mentioned. And it was me leading 30 volunteers. And then at one point, I think it was closer to 60 volunteers. Actually, it was putting in a structure that helped us grow to 60 volunteers. And then as we added the director and coach level, grew it past that before we ever hired on staff, which is, I think, necessary. You're not always going to be able to hire staff. In fact, hiring staff can sometimes be the worst decision. So you want to implement something like this. Maybe you're going to start from scratch, just finding a coach to start leading over a certain area. I mentioned in the beginning that we're going to host 3 webinars coming up, and one of them is about empowering volunteers to lead like staff. That's June 27th. You may want to attend that webinar, ask some questions, hear more about this topic. But here's some action items I think of coming out of this interview. One, of course, is you can sign up for those webinars at ministryboost.org/webinars. And then the other action step is to get the downloads. So John shared with us his org charts, job descriptions, all of that. You can get that in the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 150. And then also sign up for the email. If you don't already get emails from me, and you can get his slides from the Orange Conference presentation and use all of this, not just to look at, to see, but to draw your own structure. So sit down and kind of draw out, whether it's on a whiteboard or some org chart software or on paper, whatever. Draw your new org chart structure, which is not exciting for many people, I understand, but having a structure and leading through it is so important. So draw your new kind of dream structure. What would that look like so that you can start working towards it? And the last action step would be just to recruit one person. Who's one person that you can recruit into one of those roles on the org chart that you're currently filling? I think that's where you start, and then you go and get one more person, right? And we'll talk more about it in that webinar if you want to sign up for that, some tips, tricks, different things you can do to help recruit coaches. But I love saying start with one person because it can seem overwhelming, especially if you're like I was and you didn't have any of this. And then you hear John talk about the structure he has, and it seems like it's so far away. Just start with one, and you'll get there. Well, I hope this was helpful, and I hope every episode is helpful. And all these resources that John shared, I hope you'll go put it into action, make a difference in your ministry, add some coaches, some directors, and recruit more volunteers and be able to grow your ministry in a healthy way. As usual, thanks for listening, for subscribing, for sharing the podcast. Appreciate that. Hope you have a great week, and I'll catch you next time on the Family Ministry Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.